What if I told you that the very man who orchestrated Jesus' trial, the high priest who condemned him to death, spent his final days tormented by doubt? What if Caiaphas, the most powerful religious figure in Israel at the time, carried a secret so devastating that he could never publicly admit it? For years he ruled with absolute certainty, believing he had done the right thing. He had called Jesus a blasphemer, ensured his execution, and silenced those who questioned his judgment. But behind closed doors, the truth haunted him. The rumors of the empty tomb, the testimonies of Jesus' followers, and the undeniable fulfillment of prophecy began to weigh on his soul. And then, just before his death, something happened, something that shattered his last defenses. A revelation so powerful that it nearly drove him to confess the unthinkable. But in the end, he made a choice that would seal his fate forever. What was the secret that Caiaphas never revealed? What did he see that changed everything? And why did he take this knowledge to his grave? Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to discover will shake everything you thought you knew about Jesus' greatest enemy. But before we begin, let me ask you something. Are you subscribed to this channel? Many people watch our videos but never subscribe, and by doing so, they miss out on powerful biblical teachings that could strengthen their faith. So take a moment, hit that subscribe button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future lessons. Now, let's dive in. The confession of Caiaphas is one of the most chilling untold stories in biblical history. Caiaphas had been a man of power, authority, and unwavering certainty. As the high priest of Israel, he had presided over the most significant trial in history, the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. He had believed at the time that he was protecting his people, upholding the law, and ensuring the stability of the temple. But now, in the twilight of his life, a truth he had long suppressed began clawing its way to the surface. The memories came to him in waves, relentless and unforgiving. He had stood before the Sanhedrin, watching as the so-called Messiah was accused. He had listened as false witnesses testified against him, and yet nothing had shaken Jesus. The accusations didn't break him, the threats didn't frighten him, and even when Caiaphas himself stood and demanded an answer, Jesus simply remained silent. That silence, more than anything, had unsettled him. And then, when pressed, Jesus spoke, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Mark 14:62. That moment had been the turning point. Caiaphas had torn his robes in feigned outrage, declaring Jesus guilty of blasphemy, sealing his fate with those dramatic actions. The council had agreed. They had spat on him, struck him, mocked him. And yet, looking back, Caiaphas could not forget the calmness in Jesus' eyes. He had accepted the sentence without resistance, without pleading, without fear. That gaze had followed Caiaphas for years, and no amount of temple rituals, no number of sacrifices had been able to erase it from his mind. But the worst had come after the execution. At first, it seemed as though everything had gone according to plan. Jesus had been crucified, his followers scattered, his movements seemingly crushed. The problem had been solved, or so he had thought. But then came the rumors. First, whispers among the temple guards, claims of an earthquake, of an unnatural darkness covering the land at the very hour of Jesus' death. Matthew 27:45. Then came the words of the centurion at Golgotha. Surely this man was the Son of God. Matthew 27:54. But Caiaphas had dismissed these as exaggerations, emotional reactions to a dramatic execution. Then, 3 days later, came the report that shattered his certainty. The tomb was empty. The very soldiers who had been assigned to guard it came to him in terror, telling a story too incredible to be a fabrication. They spoke of a blinding light, a figure who had rolled the stone away, and a command that had sent them fleeing in fear. Matthew 28:2-4. They had no reason to lie. These were hardened Roman soldiers, men who feared no man, but they had been terrified by what they had seen. The high priests had gathered in secrecy, and a decision was made. The soldiers were bribed, paid to spread a different story, His disciples came during the night and stole the body while we were asleep. Matthew 28-13. Caiaphas himself had overseen this deception, ensuring that the story was spread among the people. And yet, no matter how much he tried to silence the truth, it spread like wildfire. The followers of Jesus had reappeared, emboldened rather than broken, proclaiming that he had risen, that he was alive. And what was worse, miracles were now being performed in his name. The more Caiaphas heard, the more restless he became. His once unshakable confidence crumbled under the weight of doubt. He had been so sure, so certain that Jesus was a blasphemer, that he was a threat to the temple and the nation. But what if he had been wrong? What if, instead of protecting Israel, he had condemned its very Messiah? Now, years later, his strength was failing. His time was running out. And as his body weakened, the weight of what he had done grew heavier. Every night, he was haunted by the face of the man he had sent to the cross. He had spent his life in service to God, yet he had condemned the one who claimed to be the very Son of God. The thought was unbearable. But the worst was yet to come. On the night when he finally decided to break his silence, when he could no longer keep the truth buried, a mysterious visitor arrived. A shadow in the darkness. Someone who knew more than he should have. Someone who was about to force him to face the truth he had spent years running from. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the soul, refusing to be ignored. Caiaphas lay awake in his chamber, tormented by the weight of his past. The flickering oil lamp cast restless shadows on the walls, mirroring the turmoil in his mind. He had lived his life as the high priest, the guardian of the temple, the enforcer of the law. But tonight, he was nothing more than an old man, haunted by a truth he had tried to bury. He had never spoken of it, not to his closest allies, not even to his wife. The night of Jesus' trial was supposed to have been his greatest victory, eliminating a dangerous figure who threatened the fragile peace between Rome and Israel. But instead, it had become the moment that unraveled everything. And now, as his strength waned, he knew he could no longer keep this secret locked inside. Then, without warning, a knock echoed through the chamber. It was not the hesitant tap of a servant, nor the forceful demand of a Roman officer. It was measured, deliberate. Someone was waiting. He hesitated for a moment, then called out, "Enter." The door creaked open, revealing a hooded figure draped in the shadows of the dimly lit room. The visitor stepped forward, his presence strangely unsettling yet familiar. There was something about the way he carried himself, an authority that was unspoken yet undeniable. Caiaphas straightened. "Who are you?" The stranger's voice was calm, yet it cut through the air like a blade. "You already know why I'm here." A chill ran down the priest's spine. Had someone discovered his secret? He had spent years silencing whispers, ensuring that no one could ever link him to the truth. Yet this man stood before him as if he knew everything. The visitor took another step forward. "You were there," he continued. "You saw him, you questioned him, and still, you chose to hand him over." Caiaphas felt his breath catch in his throat. He wanted to deny it, to demand that the intruder leave at once, but he couldn't. His voice failed him. The figure moved closer, the glow of the oil lamp finally illuminating his face. Caiaphas' heart nearly stopped. It couldn't be. He had seen this man before on the night of the trial, standing among the followers of Jesus. But how? Those disciples had been scattered, their leader crucified. How had this one returned? And why now? "I have come," the man said softly, "because you have something to confess." Caiaphas clenched his jaw. "I have nothing to confess," the man shook his head. "Lies do not hide from the truth forever. You know what you saw. You know what you did. And now, the weight of it is crushing you." The high priest closed his eyes, willing the words away. But they settled deep into his chest, undeniable. He had spent years pretending that Jesus was just another false prophet, another zealot stirring trouble. But deep down, he knew. He had always known. The visitor reached into his robe and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Carefully, he unfolded it. Caiaphas' breath caught again. It was a parchment, aged and worn, with writing that sent a tremor through his body. It was his own handwriting. How was this possible? He had written this in secrecy years ago, a confession he had never dared to share, a record of the events as they truly happened. He had hidden it away, locked it in a place where no one would ever find it. And yet, here it was, in the hands of the one standing before him. "Tell me," the man said, his voice gentle but firm. "What really happened that night?" The room seemed to close in around him. His past had finally caught up with him. There was no more running, no more silencing the whispers in his head. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had done. And so, with a shaking voice, Caiaphas spoke. Caiaphas had never imagined that the trial of Jesus would haunt him for the rest of his life. That night, the halls of the Sanhedrin had echoed with rage, accusation, and condemnation. He had stood at the center of it all, orchestrating what he believed was a necessary judgment. But in the years that followed, it was not the shouts of the crowd that kept him awake, it was the silence of Jesus. From the very beginning, the trial had felt different. The accusations against Jesus had been weak, conflicting, and at times absurd. Witness after witness was brought forward, yet none could present a consistent charge. Some claimed he had spoken against the temple, others accused him of blasphemy, but no testimony was strong enough to secure a death sentence. Frustration grew within Caiaphas. This man had drawn massive crowds, performed supposed miracles, and spoken of a kingdom, yet here he stood, quiet, unfazed, as if none of it mattered. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Desperate to force a confession, Caiaphas stood and demanded, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Matthew 26-63. It was a direct challenge, one that no ordinary man would dare answer. For a brief moment, the room fell into an unnatural stillness. Then, Jesus looked straight into his eyes and spoke, "You have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Matthew 26-64. Those words sent a shockwave through the room. A mixture of rage, fear, and something unspoken, rippled through Caiaphas' chest. He tore his robes, declaring, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses?" The Sanhedrin erupted in agreement. The decision was made. Jesus would be sent to Pilate. But deep down, something felt wrong. Caiaphas had condemned men before, but none had stood before him like this. There was no panic in Jesus' eyes, no plea for mercy, no attempt to defend himself. Instead, there was a certainty and unsettling confidence that shook Caiaphas to his core. This was not the behavior of a guilty man. It was the behavior of someone who knew something greater was coming. The doubt festered in his mind as the events unfolded. He watched as Jesus was handed over to the Romans, as he was flogged, mocked, and led to be crucified. He heard the jeers of the crowd as they shouted for his execution, yet he did not resist. And then came the final moment, the moment Caiaphas would never forget. As Jesus hung on the cross, a darkness unlike anything he had ever seen covered the land. Matthew 27-45. The earth trembled, the temple curtain tore from top to bottom, and the air itself felt charged with something beyond human comprehension. And then, with his final breath, Jesus cried out, "It is finished." John 19:30. Caiaphas had been in the temple when the news came. The curtain, the veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the world, was torn. The very thing that symbolized the separation between God and man had been destroyed at the exact moment of Jesus' death. For the first time, he felt true fear. Had they made a mistake? Had they condemned not just an innocent man, but the very Messiah they had been waiting for? The thought was too terrifying to entertain, so he buried it beneath his duties, his rituals, his role as high priest. But the doubt never truly left him. And then came the report that changed everything. The tomb was empty. But before he could make sense of what had happened, something else came into his possession. A parchment, aged and hidden, containing words that would shake him to his very core. And that's what we'll explore next. The news spread like wildfire. The tomb where Jesus had been laid sealed under Roman authority, guarded by soldiers, was empty. The high priests and elders had thought they had silenced the problem forever. But now a new problem had arisen, one they could not control. Caiaphas had spent the morning listening to reports from the temple guards. They were shaken, terrified, insisting that something beyond their understanding had taken place. They spoke of an earthquake, a blinding light, and a figure who rolled the stone away as if it weighed nothing. "We fell as though dead," one of them stammered. "And when we awoke, the tomb was open, and the body was gone." It was unthinkable, impossible. The official explanation was crafted. "Quickly, tell the people that his disciples stole the body while you were asleep." Matthew 28:12-13. Bribes were handed out, and the guards, still pale with fear, nodded in agreement. But Caiaphas knew better. Roman soldiers did not flee from mere thieves. Something else had happened, and the weight of his doubts grew heavier. That evening, as the temple quieted and the city buzzed with rumors, Caiaphas received an unexpected visitor, a scribe from the Sanhedrin. The man carried with him an object wrapped in cloth, something he claimed had been found among the belongings of an elder who had recently passed. It was a scroll. The moment Caiaphas unrolled it, his breath caught in his throat. The parchment was old, delicate, yet the words written upon it sent a chill through his body. It was a prophecy. Not just any prophecy, but one that seemed to describe everything that had just happened. "They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." Psalm 22:16-18. Caiaphas had recited this scripture countless times in the temple, but now, reading it in light of Jesus' crucifixion, he saw it differently. Hadn't the Roman soldiers cast lots for his robe? Hadn't he been pierced, mocked, and abandoned? His hands trembled as he continued reading. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. The words hit him like a blow. Jesus had been silent before his accusers. He had not defended himself. He had stood as though he knew this was his destiny. And then came the final passage, one that made Caiaphas grip the parchment so tightly it nearly tore. "After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities." Isaiah 53:11. The light of life. The empty tomb. The very thing they had tried to deny was written in the very scriptures Caiaphas had devoted his life to preserving. And now here it was, staring back at him, forcing him to confront the unthinkable. What if Jesus truly was who he claimed to be? The thought made his head spin. If this was true, then everything he had done, every decision, every judgment, every accusation had been against the very one he was supposed to be waiting for, the Messiah. His heart pounded. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He knew what he had to do, but the truth had a cost. Would he risk everything, his position, his life, to admit that he had been wrong? Would he dare to confess what was now painfully clear? His next decision would change everything, and that's what we'll explore next. The weight of the truth pressed on Caiaphas like never before. The scriptures he had read countless times, the events he had orchestrated, and the rumors he had dismissed were now colliding in a way he could no longer ignore. The empty tomb, the terrified guards, the ancient prophecies, they all pointed to the same conclusion. Jesus had risen. He sat in silence, staring at the scroll in his trembling hands. His entire life had been dedicated to upholding the law, protecting the traditions of Israel, and ensuring the purity of the temple. But what if, in his devotion, he had blinded himself to the very thing he was meant to recognize? What if Jesus had truly been the Messiah? The voices in his mind warred against each other. On one side, everything he had built, his authority, his reputation, his legacy, would crumble if he admitted the truth. The people would turn against him, the Sanhedrin would never forgive him, and Rome would see him as a traitor. He would lose everything. But on the other side, something even greater loomed. What if I am standing against God? He thought back to Jesus' trial, to the moment when he had torn his robes in outrage. He had declared Jesus guilty of blasphemy, convinced that he was just another false prophet. But now, the words of Jesus echoed in his mind like a ghost that refused to leave. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Mark 14:62. Had he known? Had he seen what was to come? A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. A temple guard entered, eyes downcast, hesitant. High priest, there are whispers among the people. Some say they have seen him, that he is alive. Caiaphas closed his eyes. The movement was growing. Jesus' followers, once fearful and scattered, were now boldly proclaiming his resurrection. Some claimed to have spoken with him. Others swore they had witnessed his wounds, touched his hands, heard his voice. Even members of the Sanhedrin were beginning to question. He knew what he had to do. He rose from his seat, the scroll still in his grasp, and made his way toward the temple. His heart pounded with every step. As he entered the sacred space where he had so often presided over sacrifices, he looked at the altar, the place where lambs were slain for the sins of the people. And then it struck him. The Lamb of God, that's what John the Baptist had called him. Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. John 1:29. Caiaphas felt his knees weaken. Had the final sacrifice already been made? Had the system he had defended for so long already been fulfilled? He had a choice. He could confess what he now believed, that Jesus was the Messiah, that he had truly risen, that his sacrifice was the final atonement. But to do so would mean losing everything. Or he could remain silent, keep his position, pretend he had never questioned, never doubted, never seen the truth staring him in the face. The weight of it crushed him. But before he could make a decision, another voice, one that had been silent until now, spoke from the depths of his soul. You already made your choice, Caiaphas. And he knew. He had made his decision long ago, the moment he stood in that courtroom, the moment he raised his voice against Jesus, the moment he sent an innocent man to his death, the moment he let fear of losing power dictate his actions instead of seeking the truth. It was too late. Caiaphas closed his eyes, gripping the scroll one last time. He would carry this truth to his grave, locked away with the memories that refused to let him go. The world would never hear his confession, but he would never escape it. And in the silence of the temple, as the rumors spread and the world changed, the high priest who had condemned Jesus finally understood what he had done. But understanding would not save him. Caiaphas spent his life defending the temple, enforcing the law, and silencing threats to his authority. But in the end, the truth was louder than his power. He had stood face to face with Jesus, condemned him, and sent him to the cross. Yet, despite all his efforts to erase Jesus' name from history, the truth remained: the empty tomb, the prophecies fulfilled, the growing movement that refused to die. The high priest who thought he was delivering justice was actually fulfilling prophecy. The very act that was meant to silence Jesus only proved that he was exactly who he claimed to be. Isaiah 53:3 had spoken of him long before. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. And yet, his suffering was not the end. It was the beginning of salvation. But Caiaphas, he never embraced that truth. He saw it, he felt it, but he could never bring himself to say it aloud. He had too much to lose. And in the end, the silence that he imposed on others became his own prison. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think was Caiaphas' greatest mistake? Do you believe he truly realized the truth in his final days? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a biblical study that could strengthen your faith. If this message challenged or encouraged you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. If you want to explore more biblical mysteries, check out the next video appearing on your screen right now. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for being here today. Keep seeking, keep believing, And remember, truth always finds a way. See you in the next video.